one year. I'm very glad that I could make it, and in particular because today, although this is of course symbolic, but it's the Nile Day, or the Nile country celebrate as the Nile Day. So I think it's a good occasion to have a talk like this. So when there was the invitation and I accepted, the idea was to talk mainly about Southern Sudan and its implications for the Nile hydropolitics. Meanwhile, it seems that reality is becoming a little bit faster than our analytical capacities, and there is the Egyptian issue as well. Revolution, let's call it like this. So there will be also, I will also include what I see as the implications of the Egyptian situation for the Nile hydropolitics as well, although the presentation is mainly about Southern Sudan. So as the title says, this will focus mainly on the fact that there will be a new Nile state in the short period. So the independence of Southern Sudan, so now it's confirmed that will be independent, will be in July this year. And being that, Southern Sudan will become the 11th country in the river basin. So, and what are the implications? Well, because I didn't know who I was going to have attending this conference, I decided to have some small introduction about the Nile basin, just in case people are not acquainted with that. And I think it would be, I mean, I would not jump directly in the issue without showing a little bit. Although I'm going to be very brief, and if you have any questions, I mean, even during the presentation, if you would like to know a little bit more, I can stop and give more details. So, and of course, it's always a good idea to start by a map and to show where is the river basin. Then I will show in detail. But this is the map that is being used all over. In most of all the Nile presentations, you always find this map. First of all, it's a good map because it shows the countries, the 10 countries that are part of the river basin. So, and for those that do not know, basically the Nile has three main parts of the river: the White Nile that is coming from the equatorial lakes, Lake Victoria. So here we have the recipients: Tanzania, Burundi, Rwanda, Kenya, and Uganda, and then Sudan. And the Blue Nile that comes from Ethiopia, and also the Geze that comes from the highlands of Ethiopia. And they join in Khartoum, the capital of North Sudan now, and they continue as the main Nile to Egypt. And we see the borders, so the black dash borders are the countries, and then we have the green, what you can say, the green shade, that is the borders of the basin, of the watershed, that is the Nile basin. And as you will see in other detailed maps that I'm going to use, most of the basin lies inside Sudan, so what is the whole Sudan right now, and great part of it is in Southern Sudan. But I'm going to use the same map again later on. Then if we are talking about the region itself, I mean, regardless of the water source, we are talking about 10 countries for the moment, 160 million inhabitants, the 10 countries together, although around 40 to 50 live in this green area, let's say, so in the river basins. Most of the economies are underdeveloped, still very agriculture based, with the exception of Egypt, that has a more diversified economy, and Sudan, that is now becoming an oil state. Is a region that has been experienced a lot of conflicts, internal conflicts, but also interstate conflicts. We are talking in the last century, and low levels of regional integration, so intra-basin integration. Although there is one exception that I'm going to mention afterwards. So then, if we talk a little bit hydropolitics, this would need maybe a more extended introduction, but I'm going to be very short, and I'm sure that there will be a lot of questions about it. But water resources in the Nile. We are talking about a region that is mainly located in the northern part in a dry region, but it also crosses the tropical area in Congo, Uganda, and Kenya. But the most important that I would like to focus here, it's not so much in the hydrological details, but more in the political and economic part of it. So there is an uneven distribution of the water resources in terms of space, but also in terms of time. So most of the contribution to the river basin is in a few months of the year when there is the rainy season. And most important than the distribution, there is also an equitable utilization. So basically we have the downstream countries. By downstream I mean here Egypt and Sudan, that are the major users of these water resources, and while the other countries make little use. Then if we would see in terms of what we would call hydropolitics, is that it had been an issue, and I think most of you have been reading several things about the Nile that have been published in the last years, that water resources is seen as a sovereignty issue, as a security issue. And there is strong asymmetries between the countries. And I'm not talking only about technical capacities to use the water resources, but also in terms of knowledge, capacity of negotiating in international agreements between the states. So there is several that we could analyze. I'm not going to do it here because that was not supposed to be the presentation. And there is a situation of hydrohegemony that I'm sure that a lot of people in this room have heard already about. A concept that was developed by Mark Zeytoun and Jerome Warner some years ago, very controversial and that generated a lot of criticisms. Once again, we can go to it later on because it would be interesting to analyze, or I'm going to use this concept to analyze the impacts that the Southern Sudan independence has on these power relations. Well, finally, the main problem, and this is a kind of cross-cutting issue every time that we talk about the Nile, is that the main reason for conflict between these countries, there was never an armed conflict, but there is of course a conflict of interest, it's mainly because of problematic agreements that were signed in the past, during the 20th century. There were some agreements signed during the colonial period, but the most problematic was already one signed during the period that the countries were independent. I'm not going into the details, although I'm going to mention it, one of the agreements quite often in the presentation. And the main issue here has to do with allocation. So this agreement, which is not very usual in river basins, or transboundary river basins around the world, that's an agreement that has specific allocations, specific quantities allocated for the different countries. It's not even percentage. We are talking about volumetric allocations. And this became problematic in the relations between the countries, in particular because most of them, of the 10, 8 countries were not included in the agreement. So there is a situation, I will also be talking a little bit about cooperation, but we have basically a process here of securitization. So water became a security issue in the region, and this comes with a lot of political implications in the inter-state relations between the countries. And we will talk about the cooperation later on. So, what I wanted to say. So, all this that I have been saying until now was valid and is still valid until the end of 2010. I mean, nobody was expecting that such events would take place. Even the referendum in Southern Sudan, that now we see it as a fact that happened, people voted and the majority voted for independence. In December, when I was in Juba in December, I was not even sure, and a lot of people had doubts that the referendum would take place. So now is a reality, and we know that was a very successful referendum, but at the end of 2010, it was not yet sure. And of course, the events in Egypt, for sure, were not in the agenda at all. So, what was the political economy of the river basin pre-2011? I mean, this looks like a kind of newspaper type of article, but the things have changed radically, although the change is to come, but the events are still to be analyzed. So, but the political economy of the region in 2010, or until 2010, we had Egypt, that was an hydraulic state. I don't know if you know the meaning of it, but basically a country that the water resources play an important role in the development of the country as a state, as a nation state, that was still expanding in the sense that there were still, or there is still water resources available to develop new irrigation schemes. So there was an expansion within Egypt of irrigation schemes. monopoly, or almost a monopoly of the Nile waters, although maybe we should say that in this case it was not only Egypt, but that Sudan is also using part of it. A much stronger and diversified economy than any of the other countries. So agriculture is still being the backbone of the labor force in Egypt, but for sure not the main revenues, economic revenues of the country, being the Suez Canal, tourism, and aid, in particular from the United States, the bigger revenues of the country. So a monolithic and stable political system, in the sense that nobody would imagine that the system was even in danger. Mubarak was in power. It was expected that his son, or at least his political system, would continue in the near future. Elections were expected in end of 2011, presidential elections, although there were some elections, parliamentary elections in 2010. And a big support of the international community. I mean, the geopolitical importance of Egypt is well known, and if you have been following what happened in the last days with the US and European Union, kind of almost a silence towards what was going on in Egypt and not taking any position in favor of one side or another, shows very well the importance. One of the explanations is, of course, the peace agreement with Israel, and the fact that Egypt is the most populated country in the Middle East. But it plays also a role because of the Suez Canal, that is the main connection between the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean, and is a big corridor of transport of goods. If we look upstream, we're not trying to generalize, because I mean we are talking about eight different countries upstream of Egypt, but in general I think we could put them all in the same box in this case. Is most of them are still agriculture-based economies, and most of them rain-fed agriculture and not irrigated agriculture. Weaker economies until very recently, and just to give you an example, although the Egyptian economy is not that strong, but the GDP of Egypt is bigger than all the GDPs of the other countries together. But they are growing economies. So in the last couple of years, we see countries as Kenya, Rwanda, and even Ethiopia growing economies, although it's not substantial. And the shadow of conflict is still present. There was several cases of civil wars in Uganda, in Ethiopia, for example, and this is still there. It's still part of the political scenario. And changing geopolitics. I'm going to turn to it now. So, and when we see in the last, let's say, 5 years, what were the changes that were possible to observe in the region, is that there were a lot of new situations that all of us working in the base were trying to analyze the impacts that they would have. Because the trend is to see conflict and cooperation, but not looking necessarily at the inside. I mean, who are the other actors that we are not taking into account that are also having implications in the management of the water resources or natural resources in general? So we would have new geopolitical actors, the main one being China, getting very much involved in the region, not only as an oil importer from Sudan, but also as an investor, for example, in infrastructures. If we compare the maps, I mean the road maps of any of these countries from 2000 to 2005, we see a big difference of roads that have been mainly been built by Chinese companies. We also see new corridors. When I say corridors, it's starting to see that countries were getting more relations, being it in terms of trade, but also in terms of transports. This is particularly the case in East Africa, that have created the East Africa community that already existed, but it was kind of revamped in the last 10 years, and it was possible to see that the levels of integration and intertrade increased substantially. In particular terms of the development of water resources, we would say that there was two trends that have almost been happening in simultaneous. In one hand, and particularly the Eastern African region, towards more economic multilateralism with the establishment of the East Africa Community, and on the other side, a lot of unilateral hydraulic development. And I could have included a map here, but if we see the number of dams, although there might not be large-scale dams, but have been built in the last 10 years, and none of them were exactly a cooperative projects. It was national projects constructed with natural resources, or at least with access to very favorable type of agreements with the construction companies, mainly Chinese. And this is not unique of this region. The other one that I think it's quite important, although we are still all trying to understand what are exactly the dimensions of it, is what is usually called the phenomenon of land grabbing, that some people prefer to call it farmland acquisitions or something a little bit more soft, but basically I'm using it because it shows very well what it is. And it's interesting to observe that in almost all the countries, Tanzania, Kenya, Ethiopia, in particular Ethiopia and Sudan, that there have been an increase, and this has been at least in the last 5 years, interest for the land, the fertile land in these countries, for the development of commercial agriculture, most of it. Who are the investors? The so-called investors. I mean, the countries and the companies leasing the land, it's mainly from Gulf countries, China and India. And the main products being sugarcane and rice, although not necessarily these products. But what we see is that, of course, the interest and what they are leasing or grabbing is the land, but the region has an interest because there is plenty of water resources available. The question is that what are the implications of it? I mean, if this land is being used here, for example, in Lake Victoria, or in the sources of the Blue Nile in Ethiopia, what are the implications of it to the transboundary interactions? Because a country like Egypt that had always been worried, and we can understand about it, about the developments upstream, the unilateral developments upstream, in this case, is not Ethiopia or Uganda or Kenya developing its land and water resources. It's companies doing it. So how much does Egypt knows about what is going on? So taking into account this, so pre-2011, we could already feel that there was a change going on. I mean, things were rapidly changing. But if, yeah, there was still this slide. I mean, if we think, this is a little bit a summary of what I've been saying before, but maybe getting a little bit more in the hydropolitics side of it, is that if we would see this as a chess play, we would see, and I could have populated this with the other things. We could see who were the ones protecting it, but I'm not going into that. But I mean, there was a strong protection of the downstream position, and I mean, to be very brief, but this had been at least since the 50s, or at least since the 59 agreement was signed, but we could go even back in history to explain that, is that there was dialogue. So the two countries, Sudan and Egypt, having a very similar position. One of the reasons, because they have an agreement, a bilateral agreement they sign, and that they have to respect. The other one is that this agreement is very specific, explaining that the two countries have to have a unified position. Of course, they also have interests in the sense of they have all these water resources allocated to them, to the countries, to be developed, and so far they haven't been using all of it. So there was still a margin for development. At the same time, as I mentioned before, there was already some changes going on in Sudan, and Sudan is also one of those that have been developing unilateral projects without the permission from Egypt, the downstream country. But Egypt pretended that was not seen, because the important was to maintain this strategy of having a position, the two countries, downstream countries, against the others. of course, this very much with the protection of the international community. I could go into the details of the Nile Basin Initiative and how the cooperation process was somehow protecting this status quo situation. Okay, we would say that this is the status quo situation. On the other hand, we would have no strategy here. I mean, until very recently, there was not, or countries wanted to develop their water resources, but not having any particular strategy. And what we see now is that, and this is something that has just started being developed, and maybe it was not even a strategy that was planned, but it evolved in a certain way, that the creation of establishment of upstream block. So what we would have before, we would have Ethiopia and all the other East African countries that would have their own strategy, but never they were acting as a bloc. And what we see in 2007, and I will explain why was that in 2007 and then in 2008, the countries have started to have a unified position, Ethiopia plus the East Africa community countries. Well, this Middle East, both India and China, it was what I was telling you about the new developments and players in the region, including the land grab and oil. So why this upstream bloc was created, or established, or started growing bigger? So I'm not sure that you are aware, but since '99 there is something in the Nile Basin that is called the Nile Basin Initiative, and the stands for Nile Basin Initiative. That was a process very much started by the donor, international donor community, bringing the countries together in a process of starting the first steps of what could be a cooperative institution between the 10 countries of the River Nile. So the first steps was basically to create a shared vision, and there was plenty of projects that had been implemented. But the main goal of creating a shared vision was to prepare, to enable an environment for investment projects. So in the sense, the potential in the Nile Basin is enormous. It's one of the regions, one of the basins in the world that have been knowing not that much development, so the scope for action was very big. But the idea is that this NBI, and when they started this in '99 or a few years before '99, is that this would be just transitional. It was not exactly an institution. It was, as the name says, and that's their name, it's not me naming it, transitional cooperative management arrangement. And the idea is that at the same time there would be some negotiations, and these two processes were running in parallel. This was basically technical people that would come together to develop and identify projects, and this would be the political leadership of the countries having negotiations on legal and institutional issues, and the outcome would be a legal and institutional framework for cooperation. And once they would arrive to this stage, so once the cooperative framework agreement was decided by the countries and adopted and ratified, so signed and ratified, so in that case the NBI would disappear as a transitional arrangement, so this would just be replaced by a commission, a Nile Basin Commission, that would be the executive body with a legal status, an institution by itself, and that could implement the investment projects that the NBI had identified. So the role of the NBI was to identify, and then the commission, that we still don't know how it looks like, but there are some consultants studying it, the different possibilities of the commission, but this would be a permanent river basin organization, as it exists in other river basins. Well, and in 2007, so let's say when this started, they thought, okay, this can take maybe 5 years, it's a difficult process, international negotiations, they take time, might take 3, 4, 5 years, but 10 years later, they were still negotiating, being very picky about the comma and the different kind of formulations of the different articles. And this had around 39 articles, they agree on 38 and they didn't agree on 1. Oh, but the question is that this became the Trojan horse of the upstream riparians, saying, okay, Egypt has very similar, Egypt and Sudan have very similar positions from 1999 to 2009, and we need to move forward. This is not working for us anymore as cooperation because it's not being translated on projects on the ground. So in that case, we need to have this sign. And during the negotiations of this, there was this particular detail that is saying that 2/3 majority, I mean, a little bit like there was this idea in the European Union that if not all the countries can move at the same time, so we can have some that move forward and the other ones can join afterwards. So there was this idea that as far as 2/3 of the countries, 2/3 of 10 are, 2/3 of 9, because Eritrea was not part, are 6. So once 6 countries would sign this, we could move forward to the Commission. So, and of course, 6 out of 9 means that they could move forward without Egypt and Sudan. But in the long history of the Nile relations, this was out of question. I mean, never the countries would come together to have a unified position. And in 2007, there was this idea, okay, if those that do not want to cooperate, they stay behind and we move forward. So, and I'm not going into the details of 2007, 2008, 2009, but last year in May, 14th of May of 2010, the 7 upstream riparians were supposed to sign an agreement, to sign this agreement, although from the 7, 2 were not present. And one could say that there was a pressure, a very big pressure from the downstreams of Egypt and Sudan for these 2 not to sign, because now they have 5 signatures. And with 5 signatures, they cannot do this step. Although it's possible that today, in a certain country, in a certain city in Congo where there is being celebrated the Nile Day, it was expected that the 2 countries that are missing, that are Burundi and Congo, could sign it. They have until May next year, because there was a period of 1 year to sign the agreement. They can still do it. Or they can, of course, give 6 months more for the countries to join. But this is important to say that this doesn't exclude Egypt and Sudan. They could still join. They can still join at any time. They were part of the negotiation. The question is now, and now let's go to Southern Sudan. Where does Southern Sudan fit here? A new country, didn't exist during the negotiations. Can they join this if they want, once they become an independent country? Do they want to join it? Will they be part of the 59 agreement that was signed on their behalf, if they want it or not, but on their behalf by the whole Sudan? 10 minutes only. So, 2011, revolutions in the Nile Basin. So nobody would expect in 2010. But one is the velvet divorce, to use a Czechoslovakian term, in Sudan, and the other one, the popular uprising in Egypt just a few weeks ago. So Southern Sudan, just for you to have an idea, the same map that I had before. So these are the borders of Southern Sudan. That is the ones divided in 56 when Sudan got independence from the Anglo-Egyptian condominium. So these are going to be the borders of Southern Sudan. And you can see great part of the river basin, so the green part, the green shadow, is in Southern Sudan. I have some other nice maps that show very well the characteristics of the White Nile. So the one crossing Southern Sudan here is the White Nile, and we have this band. I will explain what is this. But basically, if you see, this is population, it's not really very dense populated. If you compare it with Egypt or Ethiopia here, for example. Here we have the rainfall average, although of course doesn't have the same levels of rainfall that Lake Victoria, but still we have it. So this is the Nile. But this is the most interesting map. If we have here evapotranspiration, so available runoff. And if we see it, okay, it's a quite water-endowed region, but the levels of evapotranspiration are really high. So if we would think that the contribution of this Nile River, so Blue Nile and White Nile, is 14 billion cubic meters of water, around 4, that's the estimates, are lost here for the environment. This is a swamp area. I mean, the whole Southern Sudan is almost, it's one of the biggest swamp areas in the world. Still resisting. So 10 minutes. So Southern Sudan political process, just some periods of time. So that we have a little bit a notion of the political process. So in April 2010, there were elections in the whole Sudan for presidential elections. Although in the southern Sudan there was also elections to elect the president of southern Sudan. So this was done. It's interesting that it happened before even the referendum had occurred, but now there will be a 5-year period of an elected president. In June 2010, and this is important for our issues, there was a memorandum of understanding signed between North and Southern Sudan to start negotiations for after the referendum. I mean, it's not that much common around the world to have countries that split, or in this case, that one country is a secession from another. I mean, we have, of course, the case in Africa, the case of Eritrea. We have the case of Kosovo in Europe, East Timor, but there is not so many cases. So what happened to, I mean, this is just some of the issues that are of concern, but I mean, it's a whole set of issues. So between July 2010 and July 2011, why July 2011? The peace agreement between North and Southern Sudan was signed in January 2005, although the interim period started in July 2005, so it's in July 2011 that the peace agreement, the interim peace period will end. So these negotiations will go until there. In January we had the referendum, 70% of the population voted in the referendum, 99% voted in favor of independence, but it's in the 9th of July of 2011 that Southern Sudan will become officially an independent country. So, but the negotiations, and this is quite important, that have been going on between North and South Sudan. There is oil, of course, is the main issue being negotiated. That includes what will be the sharing after July 2011, because I was showing the map. Southern Sudan will be still using the North Sudan territory to export its oil, the pipeline across North Sudan, citizenship, who is a Southern Sudanese, who is a Northern Sudanese, currency, national debt, that was a big discussion. I mean, who is going to take all the national debt of Sudan? Would be shared 50-50 or not? Border demarcation, security issues, and for the purpose of this presentation, what is more important is what happened to international treaties and natural resources. And the two of them include, of course, the Nile issue. So what is the position of Southern Sudan in the Nile issues? So basically, in theoretical terms, in theoretical legal terms, there is two possibilities, extreme ones. That is the new country that secedes from the other, recognize all the international treaties as part of their own foreign policy or whatever, because we are talking about plenty of international treaties, not just the borders, that is also problematic, but anyway. But for example, the Ramsar Convention or the UN Convention on Human Rights, whatever, all these international treaties, what happened? And the 59 agreement is an international treaty because it was between Sudan and Egypt, and then in terms of if they recognize the agreement, so what happened? The other theory is that what is called tabula rasa, that's, okay, none of the agreements are accepted or acknowledged as part of the new country, and new ones have to come. Well, in terms of the Nile, these were the four scenarios. So there was a study that we have done at SIWI about the different possible scenarios of Southern Sudan. Of course, this is not a scenario anymore, but because we wrote it in December, there was still the possibility of unity between North and Southern Sudan. So this is not a scenario anymore, but it was some time ago. One is independence, and Southern Sudan acknowledged the 59 agreement as they being part of the 59 agreement as well, or otherwise they revoke the 59 agreement, or the wait and see. One can say that the strategy they are following right now is this one, the wait and see, and postpone it as much as possible to take a decision. Because these two are two very different options available. So one is that Southern Sudan decides, okay, better to have an allocation that at the end of the day is what all the countries in the Nile Basin would like to have. And they have their negotiation, well, if they enter, of course, that they have to have defined how much is the allocation of Southern Sudan, so renegotiating of the 59 allocations. One could imagine, oh, but if there is 3 countries, or there is now 1 new country in the agreement, it should be renegotiated between the 3 of them. But the pre-agreement was that North and Southern Sudan will renegotiate, but the Egyptian quota remains intact. This is already decided. Then, another problem, what is the problem with this 59 agreement? If we go to the details of the agreement, one is that it requires a unified position between the countries signing it. So that's why Egypt and Sudan have been seen like a pair that moves together all the time, because the agreement requires that, the Article 5. That, of course, is not going to be very well accepted by the upstream riparians, and we have to see that in hydrological terms, cultural terms, geographical terms, there is much more connection between Southern Sudan and the southern neighbors. But in political interests, maybe the alignment is with the downstream neighbors. The price to pay of this scenario is that they be most likely obliged to accept a very unpopular project that is also included in the agreement, that basically I will show in the map what it is, but is a project that could save this amount of water that is lost for the environment, that could be saved through a pure engineer project, that is to build a canal that would destroy this White Nile band, and it would save around 4 billion cubic meters for the project. The agreement doesn't necessarily talk about Jonglei Canal, they talk about water conservation projects, but that's what it means. And the Southern Sudanese second civil war in the mid-80s, one of the issues that was part of the conflict was exactly this canal. That was almost completed. 2/3 of the almost 300 kilometers of the canal, they were already built. And the project was bombed and, of course, interrupted. The other option is, of course, that they said, okay, we have nothing to do with this agreement, we are becoming an independent country. We already had a fight not for independence, but I mean, a fight with North Sudan in the 50s when Sudan got independence. And in that case, we revoked the 59 agreement using this principle of tabula rasa. That is what a lot of the other countries is the same kind of argument that they use for the colonial agreements. And they decided we want to be a full member of the cooperative framework. We sign the agreements and we align with the upstream countries. Of course, this is what Egypt had been trying to prevent in the last years. I think after the main traditional donors, let's call it like this, in Southern Sudan, Egypt is the most present in Southern Sudan, or is almost the only Arab community in Southern Sudan is from Egypt. The price to pay here is, of course, that Southern Sudan loses the opportunity to have its own allocation. 2 minutes. Oh no. So what are you doing? So some few maps just to show. So the map of south of Sudan. This is vegetation during the dry season, and I just want to show this, the project that I was talking about. So basically, if you see the other map, so let's just go back. If this is Southern Sudan, and we have seen in the map again that there is this band. So the project I'm talking about, or the project they are talking about, is the Jonglei Canal. Basically, this is around 300 kilometers. This would simply disappear. This is a canal, an open air canal, that would bring the water there. Okay. So, this is very important, is that the connection between oil and water qualities. So, the feeling I had, I mean, for the 2 times, or the 2 times that I spent more time in Juba, is that, okay, it is an important issue, Nile is an important issue, but it's far from being the most, the biggest priority right now. The oil is the biggest priority. If we see here, this is the blocks that have been identified of oil and gas concessions, although most of it's now being exploited here, that this is the region that is being disputed by the North and Southern Sudan. Most of these ones are not yet being exploited. And the oil pipe I was talking about is this one that connects to Port Sudan and then takes to China and Malaysia, that are mainly the two companies, the two countries involved in the oil business here. So whatever, even when the Southern Sudan gets independence, they will be not cutting their relations with North Sudan, because of course the main economic revenues, that is the oil, will be totally dependent of the North to use it. So one of the questions that is being negotiated right now is that what happens, I mean, what is going to happen? The revenues, because until now it was the 50-50. The two countries were getting 50% of the oil revenues, but now, do they keep the 50-50? Is going Southern Sudan to be paying royalties to North Sudan to be using their territory? Let's say in the next 10 years, most likely, this will continue being the same one. But the other option, and it's already being studied and it's already being negotiated, it's Southern Sudan not wanting to be dependent of North Sudan to export its oil, would be used an alternative one. First of all, the distance, well, I think the distance is more or less the same, but it would be to build an alternative oil pipeline connecting to Kenya, and it wouldn't be Mombasa where there is a port now, but the development of a new port in Lamu. And this to happen, so in that case the dependence of Southern Sudan from the north wouldn't be that big. In any case, most of the commercial relations right now, trade relations of Southern Sudan, is with Kenya and Uganda. And they will be part of the East Africa community that we talked before. Meanwhile, in North Sudan, should I jump, please?
No, go ahead.
I think there is, okay, I'll just let it in here. The window of opportunity to end the Nile Valley unit, that is this position, the two countries together, and most likely in terms of development options for North Sudan, that now, or in 10 years' time, or in 20 years' time, will lose oil as part of his economic revenue, would be back to irrigation, knowing that the potential of North Sudan is huge. Okay, but I will let this slide. Egypt, this is short, it's 2 slides. Egypt, the revolution, and the Nile. So, I mean, I think this question is, of course, very natural. Okay, so what are the implications for the Southern Sudan independence to the Nile hydropolitics? We can see the different options. We cannot say it will happen A, B, C, D. In the case of the events in Egypt, it becomes a little bit less clear what can happen. One thing is for sure, is that the Nile has the main, unified element in Egypt. I mean, 95% of the population live in the Nile banks and delta. It will not change. I don't see the discourse of Egypt changing in terms of water policy. The change can be in their foreign policy. I mean, changing the regime in Egypt, that is not yet happening, but it might happen, could change the options in terms of foreign policy that have been always very much oriented for the Middle East and for the US. But whatever the new government in Egypt, it could change their relations with the African countries, and thinking if we are asking for justice and equality within our borders, maybe we should also look downstream to the people contributing with the Nile water and seeing in a different way. The other possibility is, of course, a negative change, that if the revolution will take a position of dividing people in Egypt and looking for an element that unified people, the Nile could be, and we could be brought back to this kind of nationalist type of discourses that there was in Egypt already, and the Nile could be one of these elements joining it. Well, last but not the least, in terms of analytical power relations and this idea of power relations that are asymmetric between the countries, what we can see now is that Egypt has a stable hegemon, and that had been hegemonic power in the basin, that had been using this as a way to promote its own agenda and interests in the basin, is now part of the history. And being in a weak position now, can the other ones take advantage and saying, well, what Egypt had been doing for a long time, taking advantage of our weakness, internal weakness, might now turn the other way around, and the countries, including the Sudans, and I put it in the plural, using it as a tipping point to change. And this can happen in the next few months, or it could happen even today. I mean, if the countries decide to take a shortcut and say, okay, we need a change in the politics, and now is the time that we want to move forward. If Egypt has internal problems, that's its problem. Okay, so the last question, and then I stop, is that, so what occurs when the counter-hegemonic riparians, in this case the upstream riparians that we're used to see as the weak ones, get stronger, a little bit more of economic stability, more resources, the oil being a factor, and the hegemon, in this case Egypt, becomes weaker. So is there a transformation of power relations between the countries? Would Sudan or the Sudans become as midstream, because now they will be in the middle of the basin, become the important ones? I mean, the kingmakers that will make the difference between upstream and downstream, or the end of the hegemonic configuration? Okay.
Wonderful. Thank you.